Hello everyone. Who never dreamed of finding an ancient treasure, hidden or lost centuries ago, and that would suddenly reappear, opening a window to times long past? Tonight I will tell you about real or supposed treasures that have disappeared and may be waiting somewhere to be rediscovered. As always, of course, we will take a look at the historical context and who owned them in the first place. This will take us from the Middle Ages to the last court of the Cathars in Saint Petersburg during the last years of the Russian monarchy. Let's begin immediately with our first story, the treasure of the Knights Templar, and with it, all the legends or the myths that surround the Templars. More than 700 years ago, on a Friday of October 1307, the King of France ordered the Grand Master of the Knights Templar and scores of other people from the same organization to be arrested. The arrest warrant stated that the Knights Templar were enemies of the faith, that they would all be imprisoned and forced, by torture if need be, to confess crimes ranging from blasphemy or the worshipping of idols to financial corruption and fraud. 6 weeks later, the Pope Clement called all monarchs in Christendom to arrest all Templars and seize their assets. After years of interrogations and trials, the leaders of the order would be executed, burnt at the stake, and the thousands of surviving members of this once powerful order returned to civilian life or joined other orders of knights. Everywhere their assets were confiscated. The loans they had granted were cancelled to never be repaid. And what had been the most glorious, the most powerful religious military order in Christendom was dismantled. Their fortune had now disappeared. Or had it? Did something remain, hidden somewhere? The possibility of a hidden, lost treasure is only one aspect of a multifaceted legend of the Templars, which also includes the worshipping of a mysterious entity, relics like the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, and more secrets, rumors or speculations. There is a lot to unpack. Let's dig in. I told you about the Knights Templar recently, in a story about the crusades. The Knights Templar were a religious military order, that is to say, a religious organization, but at its core were not monks or priests, but knights, who had pledged to serve their order and the church by fighting for them and helping them to pursue their goals. The main goal, the original reason to be of the Knights Templar, was to protect the holy city, Jerusalem, and the Christian pilgrims that traveled to Jerusalem starting in the 12th century, after the city had been captured by the Christians in the First Crusade. At the very beginning, when they were founded in 1119, the order was a small society of knights, and it was headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, hence their name, Knights Templar. The Templars were not the only order to appear at the time of the Crusades. In the same years, the Knights Hospitalier also emerged in Jerusalem, initially to take care of a hospital. Before them, one of the conquerors of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon, had founded the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre to guard the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Old City of Jerusalem. Another major order founded later would be the Teutonic Knights. Several of these orders became large international organizations with a presence not only in and around the place where they had been founded, but in all Christian countries. Several of them grew to several thousands of members, and they lasted for a long time. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, none of them was as successful as the Templars when it came to recruiting more members, aligning troops in the numerous battles of the Crusades, or developing diplomatic relations and acquiring influence and wealth. In fact, the Knights Templar quickly evolved from a small group of pious knights to a political and economic entity that had dozens of houses, also called commanderies, scattered across Europe and the Levant. They also had their own strongholds, and over time they accumulated considerable assets: abbeys, land, buildings, vineyards, ships, workshops. The order was joined by thousands and thousands of new members, to the point that in the 13th century only 10% of the members were knights. The remaining 90% were in support positions, taking care of the order's logistics and possessions. Part of this wealth was dedicated to their crusade-related mission. They funded expeditions, they maintained their military presence. Occasionally they paid ransoms. They paid the ransom of Louis IX, Saint Louis, when he was made prisoner in Egypt during the Seventh Crusade, for example. But this didn't stop the order from accumulating always more. Their income sources included trade, banking. They lent money to high nobles or kings who needed funding, and even financial services to the crusaders and the pilgrims. When someone wanted to go to the Holy Land or travel to another destination, they could sell or mortgage their assets to the local commandery of the Templars. They were given a letter of credit, and with this document, they could go to any other commandery to redeem funds, without having to travel with treasures, coins, or precious metals. In practice, the Templars increasingly looked and acted like an international corporation. And by the end of the 13th century, 150 years after their creation, this had begun to cause significant resentment. As long as the Crusades to the Holy Land were active, there was a justification to their wealth and power. But by the second part of the 13th century, the crusading movement was declining. Catholic states created in the Near East had lost ground and could no longer hope to retake it. So this challenged the very reason to be of the Knights Templar. But at this point, their organization was wealthier than ever, and the bulk of its possessions was in Western Europe, especially in France, which had been their historical center after Jerusalem, because most of the participants in the First Crusade had come from France. Who did they annoy? First, sovereigns. Sovereigns they had lent money to. and who were unable or unwilling to repay their debt, especially the King of France at the time, Philip IV. But it was not only kings. The popes and a part of the high clergy were also displeased. For a long time, the popes had encouraged the order because it made a very valuable contribution to the crusades, and for the papacy, the power of knights' orders that were built on religious foundations was a way of gaining secular power. They could count on organizations that were not regular kingdoms and were intrinsically bound to the Catholic Church. They had been sanctioned by the popes themselves. And so the power of these religious orders was not directly controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, but in practice it was like an extension of it. So this was perfect as long as the papacy needed them for the crusades overseas or for internal crusades. Different popes called to crusades against regions or sects that were considered heretical. We will talk about this later in tonight's story when I tell you about the Cathars. But returning to the Knights Templar, when the golden age of the Crusades ended and the Knights Templar became a bit too independent, autonomous, a powerhouse in their own right, they became irritating for the popes and for the church. They competed with the church for land ownership, for example. In medieval Europe, alongside lords, the church was a major land and real estate owner. The popes had their own small state in Italy and around Avignon in the southeast of France. But via bishoprics, abbeys, and convents, the church also owned land everywhere. Most of the time, these possessions were not exploited to turn a profit. They funded charitable works. The church was the main, and often the only, provider of food, shelter, and care for the poor. It had hospitals. In the countryside, church land was often accessible for free to the peasant communities. They could let their cattle feed on it, and that helped families support themselves. The church's income also served to commission buildings and works of art. So the idea was not to accumulate, but via land ownership, the Catholic Church stayed deeply involved in the fabric of society. Because everywhere its presence was massive, very visible, not only in spiritual or religious life, but also material life. To a point that is hard to imagine for us today if we live in a Western secular country. So, from its possessions, the Church derived a lot of relevance, of influence, power, prestige. Seeing the Knights Templar competing with the Church with all their commanderies and their acquisition of estates was increasingly disturbing to the successive popes. They went from very supportive in the early 12th century, when the order was founded, to slightly annoyed and ultimately furious at the turn of the 14th century. By the way, it is a tangent, but this issue of the wealth of the Church was not something that went unnoticed or was completely accepted in the 12th and 13th centuries. There were reactions against it, often from within the Church itself, on the grounds that it could be a form of corruption that took the Church away from its spiritual mission. For example, the early 13th century was the time of Saint Francis of Assisi and his disciple Saint Clare. who founded orders of monks and nuns, respectively the Franciscans and the Poor Clares or Clarices, with rules that emphasized radical poverty, not only individually but collectively. The communities following their rule had to own nothing and voluntarily depend on the goodwill of the people. They are called mendicant orders. They also insisted on a degree of separation from secular life, in favor of a contemplative lifestyle, dedicated to prayer for the salvation of all mankind, not just theirs. These movements did not emerge against the Catholic Church. Actually, Francis of Assisi was made a saint only 2 years after his death, which is exceptionally fast. But between other things, their appearance is a reflection of this concern that the Church and its dignitaries may have become a bit too wealthy for their own good. Anyway, for all of these reasons, the legitimacy of the Knights Templars' fortune was increasingly questioned by the end of the 13th century. Individually, the Templars were not rich. They completely depended on the order for everything, from their food and clothing to their housing. They had dedicated their life to it. But collectively, the order was insanely rich. And obviously they had a treasure, even several, in the sense that at least each of their commanderies had its monetary reserve, and maybe, even though it is unproven, they had created a big secret reserve somewhere, just in case they would need it. Now, what could a medieval treasure look like? It could be an exaggeration to imagine something very spectacular, like an entire room full of gold, silver, or gems. Why is that? Because precious metals were particularly scarce all along the Middle Ages in Europe. There were a few mines of gold and silver, but not many, and structurally, precious metals tended to get out of Europe. Commercial links with the rest of the world were not intense, but they existed, with Byzantium and Muslim regions of North Africa and the Middle East. The value of what Europe imported was structurally higher than what it could export. Medieval Europe bought spices and to a lesser extent luxury goods like fabrics, semi-precious stones, incense, ivory. Its exports were of lesser value, so ultimately there was a difference to pay in gold or silver. And as a result of this, the stock of gold and silver in Europe tended to stay flat or diminish over time. And because they were scarce, gold and silver had a very high value. So accumulating hundreds of pounds, entire chests of these metals, was simply impossible. There was not that much in circulation. And it seems that no one, even the wealthiest of kings, could have accumulated such a treasure. Real wealth in Western Europe at the time was essentially under the form of land and to a lesser extent real estate and productive assets like mills, workshops or wine presses. This is what wealthy individuals and institutions owned. So it would be most probably unrealistic to imagine a very voluminous treasure of the Templars. They were rich, very rich, but even though we lack an exhaustive view of their accounting, it seems unlikely that they ever could fill several chests of gold or silver, because no one in Europe could. This situation with a rarity of precious metals would change completely in the 16th century, when the Spanish began to bring huge quantities of both metals to Europe from America, first taken from pre-Columbian people and then extracted in mines. So via Spain, Europe was suddenly flooded with more gold than probably ever, to the point that it reversed the secular scarcity of precious metals, and this had various economic consequences, like a sudden spike in inflation. Prices expressed in gold and silver began to rise. But in the 13th century, where we are now, there was nothing of the sort, and this is why, if the Templars had a treasure, it is more realistic to imagine a chest or two, rather than a huge pile of gold. Now, why a lost treasure of the Templars? Because the order ended abruptly, and was dismantled by force. I told you before that the legitimacy of their fortune had been reduced by the end of the Crusades to the Near East in the late 13th century. They had also made powerful enemies, especially the King of France, Philip IV, the Pope, and multiple lords. These enemies had reasons to resent the order. In the case of Philip IV, the main motivation was financial. He was heavily indebted to the Templars. He owed them a fortune that would most probably never be repayable. And as long as this debt existed, it gave the order influence, leverage over him. So in collaboration with the Pope, Philip IV organized a campaign to ruin the Templars' reputation. A campaign that for the most part was pure defamation. Multiple claims were made against them in the years 1307 to 1310, some rather outlandish, but many legends that remained associated with the Templars are rooted in this period and the claims that were made against them. So let's take a look at these different legends or rumors that began to surround the Knights Templar. Among all the accusations made against the Templars, some were actually possible, like accusations of financial fraud, or acting for financial profit rather than any praiseworthy aim. Others seem to have been entirely made up to discredit them, and for secret societies, esoterists or novelists of the following centuries, these were the juiciest. In that category, we find accusations of idolatry. They would have abandoned their Christian faith to worship a god, an idol, called Baphomet. The name Baphomet appeared in trial transcriptions for the Inquisition of the Knights Templar, starting in 1307, when the order and its leaders were investigated. The term Baphomet was not entirely unknown before. Since the end of the 11th century, it occasionally appeared in chronicles or letters written by crusaders to the Near East. It is unclear what it exactly named, a demon, an ancient god, or it could have had something to do with the Muslims. It could be a corruption of the name Mahomet, Muhammad, from Arabic to Old French. The Crusaders of the First Crusade knew very little about Islam. They came from regions that were very separated from the Muslim world. So to them, Islam was part of an imprecise and broad group of pagans and heretics. The term was also used in the 12th and 13th century in poems and other texts written in the south of France. And we don't exactly know how people understood it. But it is obvious that the Baphomet was considered an evil, unchristian entity. It seems that when the Inquisition and the King of France needed to pin accusations on the Templars, the term Baphomet was already associated with the Middle East and heresy, so it was repurposed to become a kind of god that the Templars would have venerated secretly instead of the true Christian god. This was made somehow plausible by the connections of the Templars with the Middle East, with the Holy Land. They were founded in Jerusalem, and until the end of the Crusades, a few years before their trial, they had kept connections with this region. Other than this vague connection, there is no tangible proof of anything, no proof that the Templars ever developed a cult. The only elements are these accusations and the confessions of some members that were obtained under torture and often retracted later, which gives them little credibility. There is no hard evidence like contemporary texts or places of worship like temples or statues, nothing. And this is suspicious because it would have been in the interest of their accusers to expose any evidence. Like for other legends we will review in a minute, this one stayed in memories for a long time, until it entered various Western esoteric or occult traditions, especially in the 19th century. Typically, if you search for iconography, images of Baphomet, you're going to find a half-human, half-animal creature, with the head of a goat and various esoteric symbols on its body. This picture appeared in the 19th century. There was nothing of the sort before. And it also seems there is no trace of the Baphomet in the Middle East either. At least no documents or testimonies or representations indicate that such a cult would have ever existed. This is why a majority of historians think that the Baphomet is a pure Western invention, a kind of legend, possibly rooted in the corruption of an Arabic word, and that acquired substance or at least drew interest only because the Templars were accused with it, and later because occultists took it as fact to elaborate further myth on it. Maybe the figure of the Baphomet had everything it needed to be adopted in some circles in the 19th century. I told you about it in various stories already. But the 19th century was a period of interest in the occult. It saw the birth of Spiritism. People were fascinated by ghosts, ancient curses, mysteries that would have been hidden, possibly suppressed by the church. It was also the time of the so-called revivals of ancient pre-Christian religions, from different types of witchcraft to Celtic or Egyptian-inspired cults. So for people who were into that kind of things, the Knights Templar, with their history, had all the characteristics that could make them exciting. An ancient and secretive order, connected to the cradle of civilization that is the nearest, plus these accusations of occult practices dating from 500 years before. And so the Baphomet became an aspect of the Templars' legend. But plenty of other myths also popped up at the time. like a connection between the Templars and the Holy Grail from Arthurian legends. It says that the knights would have discovered the Grail and kept it. There is no medieval source of any kind that would suggest such a thing. But this hypothesis grew in the 19th century, and it kind of forms the base for the third Indiana Jones movie, if you've seen it. Or stories saying that they had found other relics, from the Ark of the Covenant to the True Cross, or hidden Gospels that would shed a totally different light on Christianity, and needed to be destroyed or hidden to avoid a new truth to be revealed. They were even connected to Freemasonry for good measure. All these different stories possibly sound familiar to you or ring a bell because they are still lingering around in pop culture. We vaguely know about them because they are productions of 19th century occultism or pseudo-historical literature that were later turned to entertainment in the 20th century. Think about the Da Vinci Code, or all these novels and movies about ancient relics hidden by secret societies. These tropes are very often connected to the Knights Templar, but interestingly there is no medieval source that supports them. They all appeared during the past 200 years. Yet another one, another enduring legend, is the curse of the Templars. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, would have cursed his accusers before his execution. So, as you see, this aura of mystery and legend is something that the Templars acquired since the 19th century, and with it also grew the interest in another hypothesis, the hypothesis of their lost treasure. After all, this is one of the most plausible legends about the Templars, because it is not supernatural, and it is even credible for such a wealthy organization. And there are records that prove the existence of monetary reserves, chests of coins, owned by the order at the beginning of the 14th century. Accounting books, testimonies, and even records of gold and silver coins ceased to be transferred to the royal treasury of Philip IV. The question is, did they manage to hide some of their money, or a large secret reserve somewhere? Several indirect testimonies tell of Templars that would have escaped with loaded horses or wagons just before the arrest of the order's masters. Indirect testimonies because they were obtained during interrogations, possibly with threats or acts of torture, and they were presented as hearsay or facts told by a third person to the interrogated Templar. So they have to be taken with a grain of salt. But they include the story of a dignitary of the order, Gérard de Villiers, escaping with 50 horses and then 18 galleys to the Mediterranean Sea, with treasures that never reappeared. Or a chest of more than 6,000 coins of gold and silver that would have been given to a fisherman for him to hide it. It is true that the Templars had horses, wagons, and fleets of ships, but there is no element to corroborate these stories. What is factual, however, is that it is not uncommon in France or England, Germany, Italy, to discover treasures by accident. Most of the time they are not spectacular, but they still have significant historical and monetary value. They can date from as far as the antiquity, and they were buried or hidden in the walls of old buildings of different periods, Some were lost when their owner died without revealing the secret, and they were rediscovered centuries later during excavation or renovation works. That includes medieval treasures. In France, for example, a chest dating from the time of the Templars was discovered underground in the 1990s. It seems it belonged to a merchant who hid it there and never came back. So it was probably not a Templar treasure, but it shows that the discovery of reserves hidden by the Templars is not unthinkable one day. There are stories about such a treasure in many different towns and castles in France, to the point that in the 1960s they were even taken seriously enough by the Minister of Cultural Affairs to organize a search at a chateau, the Chateau of Gisors, an old medieval fortress in Normandy, that for a time in the 12th century had a Templar presence. But nothing was found. So at this point, the existence of one or several treasures of the Templars remains an open question. The main problem is that there is no defined area to search for it. And if it existed, it is also possible that it was found and never made public, or that it was lost at sea, or maybe it just waits somewhere, underground or in the walls of an old building, and one day it could be found by accident. I am now going to tell you about another possible medieval lost treasure, the treasure of the Cathars. But before, let's take a minute to relax. If you haven't already, search for a comfortable position and don't hesitate to close your eyes. This story and many others will be available to lull you to sleep whenever you want, so you can let go at any time and fall asleep. If you want, you can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and other audio streaming services. And another option is on Patreon, if you wish to support this channel. On Patreon you have more options, like listening to the stories with background sounds. This one in particular is available with rain sounds. You can download them and also get updates, surveys, and advanced releases. And last but not least, you also contribute to keep this channel free of advertising breaks. Now, we are going to stay in the Middle Ages, and our second story of the night begins in 1244, in the southwest of France, near a village called Montségur. After 9 months of siege, the few dozen fighters who had defended the nearby castle against thousands of royal soldiers had just surrendered. They had been able to resist for so long, thanks to their defensive position. The castle was built on a massive limestone rock, and they had been able to receive supplies and even reinforcements during the siege. But by the end, they were so outnumbered that they could not resist anymore. The castle of Montségur was lost. And with it, the Cathar movement had been dealt a fatal blow in this region. It would continually decline and disappear a few decades later, and the Cathars would enter the realm of legends. But who were they? Why were they at war? And why do insistent rumors credit them with a treasure that would have been hidden to help the survival or the recreation of their movement? To understand it, we need to go back in time to the previous century, the 12th century, when their movement, their sect, began to thrive in the south of France and the north of Italy. Cathar comes from Greek katharos, meaning pure, and Catharism first emerged in Western Europe in the south of France, in the city of Albi, which is why its adherents were also sometimes referred to as Albigensians. It can be described as a Christian movement, but one that had aspects and beliefs that strongly clashed with the dogmas of the Catholic Church. The movement was dualist, which means that the Cathars believed in two gods or two deistic principles, one good and the other evil. The good God could have been the one of the New Testament, whereas the evil God would have been the one portrayed in the Old Testament. This evil God would have created the physical, material world, and the good God would have been the creator of the spiritual realm that was promised to the faithful after death. What could have favored this concept is that the God of the Old Testament appears strong on demands, revenge, and punishment, with episodes like the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the flood narrative, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the plagues of Egypt. In contrast, the New Testament is focused on redemption. At the heart of it is the narrative of God becoming human and suffering for mankind, for the remission of sins, and it contains a promise of eternal life. All these texts have been interpreted in various ways along history, but it is fair to say that the tones are quite different between the Old and New Testament. And this kind of dualist belief actually had a history in the Christian world before the Cathars. It may have originated early in Christianity and in Jewish communities in various sects, as early as the late 1st century. It seems the Cathars were influenced by movements from the Balkans and the Byzantine Empire, such as the Paulician movement, a sect in Armenia that originated in the 7th century, and also the Bogomils, another Christian dualist sect, founded in Macedonia in the 10th century. Somehow, possibly via ascetic leaders, this set of beliefs traveled westward and took hold in this region of France. From there, it expanded among different groups that were seduced by this religious teaching. The Cathars did not become the majority in these regions, but they ended up representing a visible alternative to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in the 12th century. These different groups of Cathars did not share an exact same set of beliefs and practices. There were many nuances and local characteristics to their practice. But they had in common this dualist vision of the divine and a few other traits. These traits include the fact that they were a Gnostic movement. That is to say, they emphasized personal, spiritual knowledge, the exploration of spirituality and their relation to God by each individual, rather than following traditions, teachings, or commands of a religious authority. They also believed that human spirits or souls were the spirits of angels trapped in the material world, in the realm of this evil god, and that these spirits, our spirits as humans, were destined to be reincarnated until they achieved salvation and could rejoin the good God in heaven. to achieve salvation, to put an end to the cycle of reincarnation, the Cathars had a ritual, the consolamentum, a form of baptism performed when death was imminent. To come close to salvation, the Cathars were invited to tend to reach the state of perfect. The perfect was an individual who had become eligible to return to the good God. And this title of perfect or perfecti was increasingly given to the leaders of the movement. Now, you don't need to be an expert in Christianity or Catholicism to immediately see that the beliefs of the Cathars were problematic for traditional or dominant orthodoxy. A dualist God, the idea that the God of the Old Testament would be the devil, reincarnation, the rejection of the Catholic Church as a legitimate guide, sacraments that were not recognized by the organized church, all of this was quickly considered unacceptable, a totally heretical set of beliefs. Because we were in the Middle Ages, the concept of freedom of religion or the peaceful coexistence of interpretations of the Christian faith that were at odds, these were just unthinkable. Sometimes out of necessity, the church found accommodations, but in that case this was happening near the heart of Christendom, south of France, north of Italy. And because religion was so deeply interwoven with social life and politics, rejecting the teachings of the Catholic Church to adopt others that were so different could not be regarded as a simple private matter of conscience. It was seen as sedition, an antisocial behavior. Something of this is similar to the reasons why the first Christians were persecuted by the Romans. Religion played a part in it, of course, but mainly because this particular religion, Christianity, was seen as seditious, hostile to Romanity, to the values and social organization of Rome. So, returning to the 12th century, the Church denounced Cathar practices early on, especially this consolamentum ritual, this pre-death baptism that was supposed to open the doors of the heavens. Now, even though it is often represented differently, the first reaction of the medieval Church in case of heresies or disagreements on dogmas was almost never violence or persecution. It always tried persuasion first, and coercion would start only later as a last resort when other ways had failed. The Pope at the turn of the 12th century was Innocent III. I told you about him lately in the story about the Crusades. His name remains associated with the Fourth Crusade, the one that ended in the sack of Constantinople and the explosion of Byzantium, completely missing its goal. So Innocent III sent missionaries and tried to persuade local secular authorities to act against the Cathars, or withdraw their support to them, because some small lords had been seduced. It didn't work well, and sanctions mounted, but the movement did not disappear, and this decided him, the Pope, in 1209 to call to a crusade against the Cathars, a religious war to suppress them as heretics that represented an internal threat to Christianity. At this point, violence really started. There was a 20-year-long campaign that ultimately succeeded in weakening the movement. The Cathars were very decentralized, which was a weakness, but also an element that made them resilient. They didn't field armies. They had a multiplicity of small villages, fortified farms, or strongholds. The siege and fall of Montségur, that I told you about before, was the last major military operation against them, and it happened at a time when the Cathars had already been very weakened. After that, several decades of control by the medieval Inquisition, when people were interrogated and investigated to check their beliefs, led to the disappearance of the movement by the years 1350. Here again there is this depiction of the Inquisition prone to burn heretics. It is not that it is false, executions happened, but they were the ultimate stage reserved to leaders of the movement or people who would repeatedly refuse to reject their heretical faith. If they accepted to do as they were told, or pretend to, they would be reintegrated into society and considered Christians again. Burning them at the stake was a last resort outcome. To give you an idea, in the years 1245 and 1246, more than 5,000 people in the region of Toulouse, in the south of France, were suspected to be Cathars and were interrogated. Only 3% of them, 184, were sentenced to wear a yellow cross, a sign that marked them as repentant Cathars, and 23 were imprisoned for life. None were sent to the stake. The punishment of heretics or relapses, people who had converted or pretended to convert and were caught practicing their previous faith, or witch hunts. These things happened in the Middle Ages, but it was not a high-intensity phenomenon. It would become tougher and more deadly, but later, in the very late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But in the case of the Cathars, because there was a crusade against them, and after that decades of inquisition, to finish the job, the repression was harsh. They were aggressively suppressed. Now, like the Templars, the Cathars had monetary reserves, several of them, because they had to function as a religion or as a sect. These reserves were accumulated thanks to donations and were used for charities, to feed and house the leaders, to have manuscripts copied, or during their persecution, to pay protectors or traffickers that ensured their security. Because the castle of Montségur was an important strategic position, its siege was lengthy and it was defended relentlessly until the fall. The rumor that there could have been a treasure there quickly spread. There was certainly a reserve of coins, but we don't know how many. And we also don't know if anything of value was found after the siege, when the castle was taken. This is the starting point of the lost treasure legend. A rumor that is unproven says that a few days before the end of the siege, 4 knights would have escaped the castle, possibly using underground passages inside the rock, the mountain, that allowed them to re-emerge beyond enemy lines. And they would have taken with them everything of value to rescue it and bring it to sister Cathar churches in northern Italy, because at this point, in 1244, the movement had already been almost destroyed in France. If this was true, but there is no document whatsoever, no names and no testimonies to give it credit. The treasure could have been hidden on the other side of the Alps, and it never resurfaced. Or it could have been hidden somewhere inside the castle, deep inside the mountain on which the castle was built, which would make it very hard to recover. Searches have taken place, but it seems nothing was found. The castle was entirely destroyed, dismantled, and another one was rebuilt. So if something was hidden in the walls, it was already discovered, and nobody said anything. The new castle gives an idea of what the site looked like at the time of the Cathars, but it is not the original one. Or a third hypothesis is that the besiegers found it and kept it for themselves discreetly. The army that took Montségur was led by representatives of the King of France, several local lords, and an envoy of the Pope. When the Cathars of Montségur surrendered, the fortress was evacuated orderly, but it is not impossible that someone among the besiegers found something when they entered and did not say anything. In any case, exactly like for the Templars that were dismantled 70 years later, the possible treasure of the Cathars excited the imagination of many historians and novelists. Over time it was embellished with the same elements, the possibility that the Cathars had the Holy Grail, secret scriptures, or fabulous gems coming from the East. The Templars had their historical connection with the Holy Land and Jerusalem. For the Cathars, the Oriental origins of their beliefs permitted to make or invent connections. It is all totally hypothetical because here again there is no solid proof. There was even the hypothesis that the Cathars who escaped the fortress would have gone to a stronghold of the Templars. In 1244, the Templars were still at the time of their splendor, and they were not threatened. In that case, the Cathar treasure could have merged with the treasure of the Templars. But here again, this is pure speculation. It may just be based on the appeal of connecting different legends between them. This idea actually appeared in the 19th century, unsurprisingly. What is factual is that the castle of Montségur keeps inspiring treasure hunters and novelists. And there is a parallel here with the Templars. These are two different movements with different histories and people, but superficially they have a lot in common. A society with secrets, a connection to the East. They appeared within Christendom at a time of intense fervor and religious enthusiasm. They come with tales of epic fights, which were real. They were persecuted. And interestingly, in the case of the Cathars, the movement was suppressed but not its memory in the regions where they lived. There is a kind of appreciation for them that slowly built up, probably helped by the fact that they were persecuted for their faith and disappeared. They were victims of religious intolerance. With it has grown the theory that their treasure was of a spiritual or immaterial nature. A revelation, a truth that would have been lost or hidden. This is again purely speculative, and the skeptics would probably call that romantic divagation. Maybe it is, but there is no denying that the story of the Cathars is compelling and intriguing to many. We have one last story left for tonight, And this one will take us 600 years later, at the time when the last Tsars of Russia reigned from Saint Petersburg, a spectacular and brilliant capital at the time. They would soon be deposed, and the last royal family of Russia would disappear in tragedy during the Russian Revolution. In the turmoil of the revolution, a lot of precious works of art and artifacts owned by the Romanovs, the reigning dynasty, were dispersed. They were resold around the world, and some of them entirely disappeared. Maybe they were destroyed, or they still exist somewhere, accidentally forgotten or hidden in a private collection. These lost items include several Fabergé eggs, unique and exquisite pieces of jewellery, hiding surprises or ingenious mechanisms. And this is what I'm going to tell you about now. In the years 1880, the Imperial House of Russia developed a tradition to commission and offer jeweled eggs. The Tsar Alexander III and his wife received one each for their coronation in 1883. In 1885, as Easter was approaching, the Tsar's brother suggested to commission a jeweler from Saint Petersburg, Peter Karl Fabergé, to create a jeweled egg for the queen, the Tsarina. Fabergé worked on it and delivered his first egg, known as the hen egg. It had an outer enamel shell. It could be opened, and opening it revealed a smaller golden kind of yolk, which could also be opened, like a Russian doll, revealing a golden hen. Inside the hen, which could also be opened, lay a miniature replica of the Imperial crown, made of diamond, and a ruby pendant. This gift was much admired for its refinement and ingenuity. So a few weeks later, Fabergé was made an official supplier to the court. The following year, the Tsarina commissioned another egg. This one is called the hen with sapphire pendant, and its exact design is unknown because it was lost. Its last documented location was the Kremlin in Moscow in 1922, so after the revolution. But after that, it no longer appeared, and it is unknown whether it was destroyed or is in private hands. But once again, it was a success when it was offered, and from there the tradition to order new eggs each year was established. Fabergé was given complete freedom to design new eggs. The only requirement was that each contain a surprise, and that each be unique. In total, over 30 years until the Russian Revolution, the House of Fabergé made 52 eggs for the House of Romanov. And soon these creations enjoyed great fame. A few private clients commissioned more eggs, including the Rothschild family, the Duchess of Marlborough, or the Yusupovs. The Yusupovs were a Russian princely family, renowned for their immense wealth and art collections. Over time, the eggs became increasingly complex and very diverse. They could contain automatons, extremely precious gems, or portraits. They were all identified with a different name, and the tradition ended only in 1917 with the revolution. The last imperial egg, called Constellation, remained unfinished, It was made of blue glass with a crystal base that resembles a cloud or a nebula, with an inside containing diamonds for stars, like a celestial dome, and a clock mechanism. Of these 52 eggs, 46 are scattered around the world. In museums in Russia, in America, in the UK. Some are known to be in private collections, but 6 are missing. They include the second egg, hen with sapphire pendant, that I already mentioned. This one got lost after 1922. There is also the fourth egg, made in 1888. This one was called Cherub with Chariot. Its exact design is uncertain, only a blurred photograph remains of it. It is believed to have contained a chariot pulled by an angel, with a clock inside the chariot, and its outside would have been of gold decorated with diamonds. A third missing egg from 1889 was decorated with multicolored gemstones and contained 13 small implement and toilet articles. The following lost one is the Royal Danish. It is also known from a single photograph. This one was from 1903 and was offered to the Dowager Empress, the mother of the Tsar at the time, Nicholas II, Maria Feodorovna. She was born in Denmark. The egg commemorated the 40th anniversary of her father's accession to the throne of Denmark. It was sent to Copenhagen, the capital, but its trace got lost. It opened from the top and contained miniature portraits of King Christian IX of Denmark and his wife. The latest disappeared egg is from 1909 and was also offered to Maria Feodorovna to commemorate the death of her husband, Tsar Alexander III. Finally, the sixth one was only partially lost. It was made in 1897 and the outside disappeared. Only the surprise inside remains, a heart-shaped photo frame that opened as a 3-leaf clover, revealing portraits of the Tsar, his wife, and their first child. Are these eggs lost forever? Not necessarily. They could reappear. And a good proof of that is that this is exactly what happened to an egg from 1887 called the Third Imperial. It can be opened by pressing a diamond, which releases the egg's lid on top to reveal its surprise, a gold lady's watch. This egg was kept from 1887 to 1917, the year of the Revolution, at the Russian Imperial cabinet in Saint Petersburg. Then it was confiscated with many others in 1917 and sent to Moscow, where it was kept at the Kremlin. After 1922, its trace was lost, and even the memory of its existence. But before the revolution, in 1902, a photograph had been taken at an exhibition in Saint Petersburg, and 2 experts in Fabergé Eggs recognized this 1902 photo in an auction catalogue from March 1964, meaning that in the 1960s the egg had been sold at an auction, but not identified as a Fabergé egg. It was not called as such in the catalogue. This realization happened in 2011, almost 50 years after the auction, and the auction had taken place in the UK, so it was assumed that the egg was probably still in this country. There were articles about it, and they stayed online, but the egg did not appear. Until 2012, when a scrap dealer in America went online to research the gold egg that he had purchased a decade earlier. For $13,000, based on its weight of gold and the estimated value of the diamonds and sapphires it contained. He had bought it to find another buyer quickly or sell it in pieces. And because the watch inside had a brand, Vacheron Constantin, he googled egg and the brand name, which sent him straight to British articles mentioning the disappeared Fabergé egg from 1887. Everything matched. The brand name on the watch, the size, the appearance. He realized he owned a treasure, valued at around £20 million, that's $27 million. The name and the location of this man were never disclosed. But the expert who took the trip for an expertise said it was in a modest house of the Midwest, near a highway and a Dunkin' Donuts, so he was probably not very rich. The egg was sold to a private collector for an undisclosed price, but millions, no doubt. And for the first time in 112 years, the egg was exhibited again before it was delivered to its new buyer. This happened in 2014. What happened to the egg between its disappearance in Moscow around 1922, its sale in 1964 in England, and then its purchase around 2004 at a flea market in the Midwest, is completely unknown. We can only imagine how many times it changed hands, waiting for several decades to be rediscovered for what it was. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you liked it. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. I will be back soon with more stories. In the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.